The Galactic Unity Institute was the pride of 1,000 worlds, a place where the brightest young minds of every known species came to learn and collaborate. Nestled in orbit around a cold dwarf planet, it glistened like a gemstone in the void. To outsiders, it was a symbol of peace and unity. To those who walked its halls, it was a theater of silent competition, where superiority was masked in polite diplomacy and ancient rivalries wore academic robes. Among the latest exchange arrivals was a single human, Jackson Rios. He didn't speak much. Tall, lean, with eyes that seemed too old for his age, he carried himself with a quietness that unsettled others. The aliens were used to the more animated humans, eager, expressive, constantly speaking their thoughts aloud. Jackson didn't fit that mold. He was deliberate, calm, his voice rarely rising above a murmur. Some thought he was simple. Others thought he was calculating. But everyone thought he was soft. The Thurn cadets, crystalline beings with elongated limbs and shimmering skin, were the most vocal. They found the idea of human frailty amusing. To them, humans were biologically inferior, bones that snapped under pressure, skin that tore from the lightest friction, and organs that failed under stress. The Zalari were more reserved in their critique, but it was clear they shared the sentiment. In hushed tones, they referred to humans as glass warriors. Brave, perhaps, but fragile. Always on the edge of breaking. It didn't help that Jackson never tried to correct them. When Thurn Cadet Krental joked about humans fainting at the sight of blood, Jackson didn't react. When a Zalari professor questioned if Earthlings had pain thresholds adapted to combat, Jackson only blinked. He didn't protest, didn't explain. He just listened. The silence spoke louder than any defense could have. And in their eyes, silence confirmed weakness. But behind that silence was weight. Every morning, Jackson ran 5 kilometers along the observation ring, not for exercise, but to outrun ghosts. He carried a small pendant on a black chain around his neck. Most cadets thought it was some Earth superstition. They never noticed the dog tag etched with a name no one dared ask about. He clutched it sometimes when alone, always briefly, always quietly. That dog tag had seen more than most beings in the Institute would ever imagine. But to Jackson, it was just a reminder. One he needed to carry. When the notice came about the practical field operation, the atmosphere shifted. The Institute's experimental training required cadets to test their skills on Vedran 6, a recently terraformed planet with hostile terrain. Known for sudden gravity fluctuations and aggressive fauna, it was considered a controlled risk environment. Enough danger to challenge, not enough to kill, if rules were followed. Excitement buzzed through the alien students. The Thurn polished their crystal armor, eager to show dominance in survival. The Zalari calibrated neural helmets with arrogance masked as focus. And Jackson? He checked his medpack. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. Just routine. Before departure, teams were randomly assigned. Jackson was placed with 2 Thurn cadets and 1 Zalari, a small unit meant to simulate interspecies cooperation. None of them were thrilled by the assignment. Whispers circled. Don't expect him to keep up, better hope he doesn't freeze when it counts. During the briefing, instructors outlined mission objectives, map terrain, log dangerous lifeforms, and return within 72 hours. Standard protocol. The room buzzed with excitement. Except for Jackson. His eyes weren't on the screen. They were on his own hand, absent-mindedly running a finger across a scar hidden beneath his uniform sleeve. As the shuttle descended toward Vedran 6, Jackson sat in silence while others chatted strategies. When the atmosphere turbulence kicked in, one Thurn chuckled. Hope your organs don't liquefy, human. Jackson didn't look up. Just muttered. They won't. That was all. When the hatch opened, a blast of dry, metallic air rushed in. The landscape was alien in every sense, jagged red rocks piercing the ground like teeth, sky tinted orange, and the sun barely a dim smear through thick atmosphere. Each breath was filtered through respirators, every step, a challenge. Gravity here pulsed, subtly but constantly. A rhythm that tugged at muscles and minds alike. Within the first hour, tensions were already rising. One Thurn, eager to impress, tried scaling a cliff for vantage, only to misjudge a gravity pocket and slam hard against the stone. His armor cracked. Not badly, but enough to bruise pride. Jackson didn't laugh. He was too busy logging flora samples and monitoring seismic tremors from a handheld device. The Zalari cadet observed Jackson with growing irritation. "You rely too much on instruments," she said. "Intuition matters more." Jackson didn't answer. He simply turned and pointed at a cluster of barely visible spores clinging to a nearby boulder. "These can paralyze the lungs in 30 seconds. Your kind breathes through dorsal intakes. Intuition didn't warn you. Data did." Silence followed. For once, no retort came. That night, as the cadets set up camp under the shelter of a narrow ridge, the wind howled like mourning spirits. One Thurn muttered about local predators, creatures known to hunt via vibration. Jackson offered to take first watch. No one protested. He sat on a stone, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the faint perimeter light. The others slept. Or tried to. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the dog tag. Ran his thumb across it. Closed his eyes. The sound of breathing beside him startled him slightly. The Zalari cadet had woken, sitting next to him, not speaking at first. After a moment, she asked, "That tag, was he your mate?" Jackson shook his head. "Brother." She didn't ask how he died. Maybe she didn't need to. There was a long pause before she said, "You don't talk much. But I think you're different than what they say." Jackson didn't respond immediately. Then, he said quietly, "Pain teaches faster than words." And then he went quiet again. In that moment, under a sky of strange stars and a wind that sounded almost like crying, something shifted. Not in a dramatic way, not with music or fanfare. Just quietly. Like the first crack in ice before a thaw. The morning after their first night on Vadran 6, the cadets woke to the eerie stillness of the planet. The sun, obscured by dense cloud cover, barely illuminated the jagged terrain. The team gathered their gear, the weight of their packs heavy on their shoulders as they trudged forward, following the mission parameters with all the seriousness expected from the top-tier cadets of the Galactic Unity Institute. However, as the hours passed, the tension between the species began to rise. The cadets were, by all appearances, a well-coordinated team, but the cracks in their cooperation started to show. The Thurn cadet, Krental, was the first to break the silence. He'd been studying Jackson for some time now, but his patience was wearing thin. "You still haven't said a word about the terrain," Krental remarked in a tone too sharp to be mere curiosity. "You're just walking in silence, relying on your instruments. We've been trained to understand the land through instinct. Your reliance on technology will slow us down." Jackson didn't respond immediately. His pace remained steady, his eyes scanning the surroundings as he moved. He didn't need to speak. His actions would show the others. Eventually, Krental's tone grew more insistent, more critical. "Are you afraid of the land? You've been to war, haven't you? Is that how you humans face danger, by avoiding it?" Jackson's hand briefly hovered over a mark on his medpack. It was a subtle gesture, but it didn't go unnoticed. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him. But he wasn't going to indulge in the bait. He simply nodded to Krental, his face betraying nothing. "You're right," Jackson said calmly, breaking his silence. "Technology doesn't replace experience, but it can save lives. Your kind wouldn't survive in the fields we fought on." The words hung in the air, but Krental didn't know how to respond. He was used to humans being loud, proud of their accomplishments. Jackson's restraint disarmed him. The Thurn cadet had expected resistance, anger, or at the very least, some sort of outburst, but instead, there was only quiet certainty. The Zalari cadet, Naya, had been watching the exchange carefully. She had always found humans fascinating, but she couldn't understand their resilience. For a species so seemingly fragile, they had a habit of surviving against all odds. She turned to Jackson now, her tone softening. "You never fight back. Do you?" Jackson stopped, his gaze drifting over the horizon. He didn't meet her eyes. I don't need to fight, he said. The universe fights for me. I just survive it. The words were not meant as a declaration of dominance, but an observation of truth. Jackson had never been one for grand speeches or boasting about his strength. His battles were internal. They always had been. He had learned, through years of hardship, that the greatest strength was often the ability to endure, to keep moving when everything in the universe told you to stop. But the others didn't see it that way. They saw only a human who remained calm, detached, and apparently indifferent to the dangers of the planet they were on. It was unnerving. To them, survival required constant effort, constant motion. If you didn't react, you weren't engaging. If you didn't scream or fight or push back, you were nothing. As the day wore on, the alien cadets grew increasingly frustrated. Every time they encountered an obstacle, whether it was a boulder that had to be scaled or a deadly gas pocket that had to be avoided, Jackson simply observed and adapted. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He just moved forward with quiet purpose. And that quiet strength began to unsettle them more than they would have cared to admit. By the time they reached the next designated waypoint, the team's patience was fraying. Naya, who had initially believed that Jackson was simply a quiet, detached human, began to question her assumptions. He had been calm, yes, but there was something else, something deeper in the way he carried himself. His every movement was purposeful. He wasn't waiting for danger to come to him. He was preparing for it before it even appeared. The others, still playing catch-up, didn't understand the depth of his awareness. When they stopped for a short break, Jackson found himself standing apart from the group, again absorbed in his medpack. Krental was the first to approach him, his irritation finally breaking through his diplomatic facade. "You're not human," Krental spat. "No one is this composed. No one is this calm. You're hiding something." "What is it?" Jackson didn't flinch. He had heard these kinds of accusations before. What he didn't expect was Naya's voice, suddenly cutting through the tension. "Stop," she commanded. "You're not understanding. He's not hiding anything. He's just different. His calm isn't fear or weakness, it's something else." Krental glared at her. "You've been infected by his silence too, Naya? He's no different than any other human. He just doesn't care enough to show any emotion. That's not strength. That's cowardice." The accusation hung heavy in the air, but Naya stood firm. She wasn't as quick to judge as Krental. There was something unsettlingly right about Jackson's behavior. In a way, it made sense to her. Humans, in their desperation to survive, had learned to carry their burdens quietly. Not with strength and physicality, but with a depth that spoke to resilience more than aggression. Just then, a distant rumble echoed across the barren landscape. It was low, almost imperceptible at first, but the vibrations were unmistakable. Something was coming. The question wasn't what. The question was who would react first, and how. Krental's first instinct was to rush into action, eyes scanning the horizon, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. Naya, however, took a moment to assess. And Jackson? He simply squatted low to the ground, testing the vibrations through his boots, eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of movement. His calm was not detachment. It was an understanding that no one else had yet grasped. The rumbling grew louder, closer. The creatures of Vadran 6 were not the typical beasts cadets had been trained for. They were predators attuned to the vibrations of the planet, creatures that hunted not with claws but with a sixth sense, able to track their prey by the faintest tremors in the earth. As the alien cadets readied themselves for combat, Jackson remained motionless, calculating. His expression didn't change, but inside, his mind was working at 1,000 miles per hour, processing the data from the tremors, assessing the distance, and analyzing the best possible course of action. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't excited. He was doing what he had been taught to do, survive. For the first time, the others began to understand. It wasn't about avoiding danger. It was about managing it. It was about survival in its purest form, quiet, focused, and unshakable. As the creatures drew nearer, Jackson's focus never wavered. He knew the planet was alive with peril. And yet, he moved forward with quiet confidence, knowing the true fight wasn't just against the world around him. It was against the perceptions of those who couldn't understand why he never flinched. As the mission progressed, the alien cadets couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Each obstacle, each challenge, had revealed more about Jackson than they could have anticipated. His ability to remain unfazed in the face of constant danger, his unyielding calmness, was unnerving to them. The human cadet wasn't just surviving the harsh conditions of Vagrant 6, he was thriving, adapting with an efficiency that seemed unnatural. And that unnerved them even more. For Krental, the third cadet, the growing uncertainty felt like a personal affront. Thurn pride was rooted in their physical prowess, their superior agility, and heightened senses, all of which made them exceptional hunters and warriors. But Jackson didn't rely on physical strength or superior reflexes. He relied on something else, something intangible. Krental couldn't even name it, but he felt it gnawing at him. He had been trained to believe that strength came from action, from decisiveness, from dominating the situation. But Jackson had never seemed to feel the need for any of that. He simply existed, unwavering and unbroken. Meanwhile, Naya, the Zalari cadet, was slowly piecing together what Jackson represented. Her species was known for its intelligence, its deep analytical capabilities, and its careful approach to any problem. But Jackson wasn't a strategist in the traditional sense. He didn't overthink or overanalyze. Instead, he embraced simplicity. Every choice, every decision, was focused on survival, not on winning. She had seen humans in action before, brave, strong, but also reckless. What set Jackson apart wasn't his lack of fear. It was the way he approached fear itself. The way he chose to face it without hesitation, without the need to prove anything to anyone. At first, Naya had assumed that Jackson's silence was a sign of weakness, a lack of confidence. But now, she was starting to understand that his silence was his strength. While the others relied on external validation, Jackson only relied on his own inner fortitude. It wasn't about proving anything to the other cadets. It wasn't about demonstrating superiority. It was about survival, pure and simple. The rest of the cadets, the ones who had initially seen Jackson's composure as a challenge to their own skills, were starting to crack under the pressure of the planet. The harsh conditions, the constant threat of the unknown, were beginning to take their toll. The stress was evident in their erratic movements, the shortness of their tempers, the way they kept glancing at Jackson, waiting for him to falter, for him to break, to give them some sort of indication that he was as vulnerable as they were. But Jackson didn't give them that satisfaction. His focus never wavered, his movements always calculated, his actions always deliberate. But there was more to his behavior than just self-control. Jackson's response to the dangers of Vagrant 6 wasn't rooted in the desire to simply survive. It was about understanding the nature of the threat, not reacting out of fear or panic. When faced with a challenge, his mind processed the situation quickly, coldly, without the unnecessary baggage of emotion. It was this mindset that allowed him to push through when the others faltered, and it was this mindset that drove Krental to grow increasingly frustrated. One afternoon, after an exhausting trek through the planet's dense forests, Krental could take it no longer. "You don't fear anything, do you?" he said to Jackson, his voice a mixture of challenge and disdain. "You just accept danger as if it's nothing. That's not normal. Humans aren't meant to be so indifferent." Jackson turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Fear doesn't help me survive," he said, his voice low but firm. "Fear is just a feeling. I don't have time for feelings." Krental's response was quick and sharp. "That's your problem. You've disconnected yourself from everything that makes you alive. You're not human anymore." Jackson's gaze remained steady. "You're wrong," he said. "I'm more human than you think. Because I understand what it means to be alive. It means not running away from what scares you. It means facing the worst and choosing to keep going." The words hung in the air, but Krental didn't know how to respond. For a moment there was silence, uncomfortable, heavy silence. It was as if the reality of Jackson's unshakable confidence had finally sunk in, and there was no easy way to escape it. Krental wanted to argue, to prove Jackson wrong, but something stopped him. Something about Jackson's unflinching certainty made it impossible for Krental to dismiss him entirely. He couldn't argue with survival. But the Thurn wasn't the only one who was struggling. Naya, too, found herself grappling with a mix of admiration and confusion. Jackson's resilience wasn't something she could quantify or categorize. It wasn't a traditional strength, and yet it was undeniably powerful. There were no weapons involved, no dazzling displays of force. There was simply the quiet presence of someone who had learned the most important lesson of all, that fear was a tool to be wielded, not an emotion to be controlled. The longer they spent together, the more Jackson's influence started to seep into their understanding of what it meant to face a challenge. In the face of danger, where the rest of the cadets would hesitate, Jackson moved forward. Where others might freeze, he acted. But it wasn't recklessness. It wasn't impulsiveness. It was confidence born from experience, from a quiet understanding of how the universe worked. The difference between survival and destruction was often in the ability to remain calm, to act in the face of uncertainty. At night, as they huddled around a small campfire, Naya found herself observing Jackson more closely. She had heard stories of humans, brave, stubborn, reckless, but she had never seen one like this. He didn't seek glory. He didn't ask for recognition. He just existed, unshaken by the storm of uncertainty swirling around him. And that, she realized, was something truly dangerous. The more Naya considered it, the more she came to understand that Jackson wasn't afraid to face his fears. He simply saw them for what they were, challenges to be overcome, not forces that should dictate his actions. And that realization terrified her more than any of the predators lurking on Vadran 6. Because she knew that fear, in its most primal form, could break anyone. But Jackson was different. He didn't let fear break him. He bent it to his will. Krental, watching from a distance, finally realized the truth. Jackson wasn't just a human, he was a survivor, a warrior of a different kind. A warrior whose greatest weapon wasn't a gun, a blade, or even strength. It was his mind, his calm, his unflinching will to keep moving forward, no matter what the universe threw at him. And in that, he was more human than any of them had ever known. As the days wore on, it became increasingly evident that Jackson's unyielding composure in the face of danger wasn't just a matter of innate human fortitude. It was something far deeper, something ingrained within the very essence of humanity. The cadets, who had initially viewed Jackson's behavior as an anomaly, began to see him as something more than a mere cadet. He had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of the raw resilience that humanity was known for throughout the galaxy. His refusal to give in to the pressures of the environment was a lesson, albeit an uncomfortable one, for the other cadets. Naya, whose species had long prided itself on its intellectual superiority, began to feel the weight of the realization that Jackson's approach to survival wasn't one based on intellect alone. Her species had long relied on strategy, foresight, and analytical thinking. These were the tools that made them successful, the tools that had allowed them to rise to power within their own galaxy. But Jackson wasn't using any of those tools. He wasn't trying to outthink the challenge or devise some complex plan. He was simply facing the obstacle head-on, with a calmness and clarity that seemed to defy the very logic Naya had been raised to believe in. At first, this was frustrating. Naya, who had spent countless years honing her mind to calculate every possible outcome, found herself baffled by Jackson's actions. He didn't follow the rules of strategy or logic. He didn't seem to care about what was considered the right way to approach a problem. And yet, his way worked. It worked every time. His willingness to trust in his own instincts, to lean on the sheer strength of his will to survive, was something that Naya couldn't replicate, no matter how much she tried to rationalize it. Meanwhile, Krental's frustration had evolved into something darker. The Thurn species prided itself on its combat abilities, its prowess in battle, its ability to dominate any opponent with raw strength. But Jackson didn't rely on physical power in the same way. In fact, Krental had yet to see Jackson demonstrate anything resembling brute force. It was as if the human had stripped himself of the need for such displays of power, instead relying on a strength that transcended the physical. This, Krental realized, was what made Jackson so dangerous, not his physicality, but his ability to survive without it. Where Krental had always been taught that survival was a matter of being the strongest, Jackson had shown that it could be about something else entirely: adaptability, perseverance, and an understanding of how to read a situation without letting emotions cloud the judgment. Krental couldn't help but wonder if Jackson had tapped into something that had been lost in their own culture, something pure, something primal. It was this very realization that began to shift the balance within the group. One by one, the other cadets began to follow Jackson's example. They started to shed the notions of superiority that they had carried with them from their home worlds. They began to understand that strength didn't always come from the ability to dominate. Sometimes, it came from the ability to endure. The ability to adapt, to move forward even when faced with overwhelming odds. It was something that transcended the need for power, something that was fundamentally human. But as Jackson's influence spread through the group, something else started to happen. The more the cadets began to rely on Jackson's unflinching approach to survival, the more they began to depend on it. They found themselves waiting for Jackson to lead the way, to make the hard decisions, to provide the answers to the problems they faced. And at first, Jackson didn't mind. He had always been the type of person who preferred to take control in difficult situations. But as the days wore on, he began to feel the weight of that responsibility. It wasn't just the physical burden of carrying the group that was weighing on him, it was the emotional toll. Jackson had never been one to show vulnerability, not to anyone, but the longer he spent in the company of the cadets, the more he realized that they were starting to look to him for more than just leadership. They were looking to him for assurance, for the unspoken promise that no matter what happened, everything would be okay. They were looking for a symbol of hope, and Jackson wasn't sure if he could continue to be that symbol. The pressure was building, and the cracks in his calm facade began to show. There were moments when he found himself questioning whether he could keep up the act, whether he could continue to be the unbreakable force that the cadets had come to rely on. But then he would remember why he was there in the first place. He wasn't just fighting for his survival, he was fighting for them, too. The cadets might have been learning from him, but he had learned something important from them as well. They had reminded him of the importance of unity, of how even in the most dire situations, people could come together and find strength in one another. And so, despite the mounting pressure, Jackson chose to keep moving forward. He chose to continue leading the group, not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he knew that the group's survival depended on it. The cadets needed someone to believe in, someone who could give them the courage to face the dangers that lay ahead. And if that person had to be him, then so be it. But as the mission neared its final stages, something unexpected happened. The alien cadets, who had once seen Jackson as an anomaly, as a puzzle that needed solving, began to change. They stopped seeing him as the source of their survival, and instead, they started seeing themselves as part of the same struggle. They began to take ownership of their own fate, to understand that survival wasn't just about relying on someone else to lead the way. It was about understanding their own strength, their own will to survive. In the end, Jackson had given them something far more valuable than just survival techniques. He had given them the understanding that strength wasn't just about power or intellect. It was about the will to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. It was about facing fear head-on and pushing forward, no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed. And in that, the cadets had learned the most important lesson of all, that the key to survival wasn't in the tools you had, but in the choices you made when it seemed like there were no choices left. The final test had arrived. Jackson stood at the forefront, once again in command of the cadets, though this time, the weight of leadership felt different. There was a quiet tension in the air as the group prepared for what was to come. The cadets had come to trust him, but now the question was no longer about whether they could survive. They had all proven that, individually and as a team. Now, the true test was how far they had come, how much they had learned from Jackson, and from each other. This was the moment that would decide whether they would sink or swim, whether the lessons of unity, strength, and resilience had truly taken root in them. The challenge was unlike anything they had faced before. It was not just a test of physical endurance or mental acuity. It was a test of heart. Every cadet, including Jackson, would have to put everything they had into it, not just for their own survival, but for the survival of the group as a whole. The stakes were higher than ever before, and every failure would weigh heavily on all of them. There would be no room for mistakes. As Jackson looked at the faces of the cadets around him, he felt a shift within himself. These were no longer just students, no longer just individuals that he had been tasked to lead. They had become his team, his comrades. And that connection, formed through months of shared hardship, struggle, and survival, was something he hadn't realized he was capable of forging. The emotions that now stirred in him were far from what he had initially expected. This wasn't just about teaching others how to survive anymore. This was about teaching them how to thrive, how to become something greater than themselves, something greater than the sum of their parts. In a way, Jackson had learned as much from them as they had learned from him. He had come to understand that his role as a leader was not just to command or to lead by example, but to inspire. He had learned that strength wasn't about being invincible or infallible. Strength was about vulnerability, about allowing oneself to feel the weight of responsibility, and yet continuing to push forward despite it. Strength was about enduring and showing others that they could endure too, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. But that realization came with its own burden. Jackson knew that this test, this final challenge, would be the ultimate measure of everything they had been through. It was one thing to survive the wilderness, to battle alien threats, and to endure training that pushed them to their physical and mental limits. But now, they would face something far more insidious: doubt. Doubt would be their greatest enemy, for it would challenge everything they had learned. It would force them to question themselves, to question the bonds they had formed, and to question whether all the sacrifices they had made were truly worth it. As the final test began, Jackson stood firm, watching the cadets take their positions. He had faith in them, faith that each of them had learned what they needed to in order to succeed. But the doubt was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. What if they weren't ready? What if they couldn't overcome the final obstacle? The thought lingered, but Jackson shoved it aside. He had to believe in them. If he didn't, who would? The test began. The cadets moved with a precision and determination that Jackson had never seen before. They worked together seamlessly, each cadet relying on the others, trusting that their training and the lessons learned under Jackson's guidance would be enough. As the challenge escalated, it became clear that they were not just surviving, they were thriving. Each cadet showed incredible growth, tapping into the strength they hadn't known they had. Jackson watched in awe as they moved as one, anticipating each other's actions, supporting each other when one faltered, and pushing forward even when the path ahead seemed insurmountable. It was no longer about Jackson leading them. It was about them leading each other. The transformation was complete. The cadets had become a cohesive unit, capable of overcoming any obstacle, capable of facing any challenge. They had grown beyond the individualistic mindset that had initially defined them. They were now a team, bound by trust, by shared experience, and by a deep understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses. Jackson's heart swelled with pride as he watched them work. This wasn't just the culmination of their training, it was the culmination of everything they had been through. Every setback, every failure, every moment of doubt had led them to this point. And in that moment, Jackson realized something profound. This wasn't just about him teaching them how to survive. It was about them teaching him what it meant to truly live, to lead with vulnerability, to embrace the journey, and to never lose sight of the bigger picture. As the test drew to a close, the cadets stood victorious. They had completed the challenge. They had succeeded, not just because they had the skills, but because they had learned to trust one another. They had learned to rely on each other's strengths and support each other's weaknesses. They had learned that survival wasn't just about individual prowess. It was about unity, about working together for the greater good. Jackson stood among them, his chest heavy with emotion. He realized that he no longer needed to carry the burden of leadership alone. He no longer had to be the one to shoulder the weight of every decision, of every challenge. The cadets had grown. They had become leaders in their own right. And in that realization, Jackson felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The lesson he had been trying to teach them all along had come full circle. They had learned that strength came not from isolation, but from connection. They had learned that true survival was not about conquering the world. It was about conquering the fear within, the fear of relying on others, the fear of vulnerability. And so, as they stood together, victorious and united, Jackson knew that this was not just the end of their training. It was the beginning of something much greater. They had become more than cadets. They had become a family. They had become a force to be reckoned with. And together, there was nothing they could not face.